So again, appreciate everyone that has joined with us this morning, and appreciate your patience with us and our technical issues. My name is Justin Whitley. I'm the livestock accounts manager with Drylet, focused on Manure Magic sales. The purpose of this presentation this morning is really more educational, less of a commercial. We'll obviously talk a little bit about product right at the end. But to start with, they're going to have Seth Wengert from AgVice talk about some of his areas of expertise in optimizing manure and row crops. I think we're all very aware of how important that is with the high price of fertilizer and with the events of the last 24 hours. I think we can only expect that to increase. So I'll turn it over to Seth. And Seth, just let me know when you want me to go to the next slide.
Okay, you can kick up to the next slide there, and we'll get started on that one. Thank you. We're going to kind of keep this as just, this won't include everything that we could talk about for the sake of time, but we'll try to catch on a few of the high notes. It'll be a little more focused on probably swine manure, deep pitted type manure versus lagoon manure, since that's what we see a lot of here in the Midwest. One of the biggest questions we get every fall is people get their manure test back and they wonder why it's not as good as the previous year, it's not as good as 10 years ago. So I wanted to hit on what the effects on the manure of swine diets in particular. Same can be said for beef, but it's more noticeable in swine. With nitrogen, nitrogen is a function of excess protein in a pig's diet. And a nutritionist that does swine diets has a couple of options. Traditionally, we've used a lot of soybean meal and distillers, and when that happens, the pig will essentially excrete excess protein, which we get as excess nitrogen as a row crop farmer. This also increases the volume of manure a little bit too. One thing that we see with high grain and feedstock prices is that it has become more cost effective for a nutritionist to put in amino acids as a replacement for protein, lysine being the one we hear the most about. The bad news as a row crop farmer is this makes the pig more efficient, and so we would expect to see a little drop in nitrogen value from that dietary change. On the phosphorus side of things, what we see, phosphorus in livestock diets is typically supplemented by using either what's called monocalcium phosphate or dicalcium phosphate. In pig diets, we can also add phytase. The phytase makes the pig more efficient with the phosphorus that's in there. So phosphorus, much like it is on the row crop side of things, the animal's only going to be able to use so much of that monocal or dical. If they need, they get a certain percentage of it, the rest goes out so that we have it as plant fertilizer. What happens right now is that monocal and dical have the same base stocks as the MAP and DAP monoammonium phosphate products that we row crop farmers use. Hit the next slide. So the real takeaway is this. Feed prices affect swine diets, and the swine diets affect manure. If we see, we want to be careful what we're applying for manure when we see high feedstock prices and also high fertilizer prices. These are kind of the things that are indications that we need to really watch how we're managing the manure. Hit the next slide. We'll start with the pumping time management, some of the basic stuff that we need to do to make sure we have good crop yields for the next year. Agitation, this cannot be understated. Depending upon the configuration of, say, a 2,400 head barn, I want to see 2 to 3 pumps in there. And those pumps ideally need to be set up so that we can try to move the manure in a circular pattern. Some barns we can do this easier than others on, but that's the goal anyway. We also need to start agitation before we start pumping. How many times has somebody you've seen at the manure pumper shows up, drops the pumps in, and immediately starts filling tanks? That's not going to give us a consistent product. There's quite a bit untreated manure. There's quite a bit of stratification of nutrients. It is not uncommon to see in a deep pit to see maybe 30 or 40 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons towards the top of the pit, and 80 or 90 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons at the bottom of the pit. So we've got to make sure that's homogeneous. Alluding to the earlier slide on the swine diets and what cost implications those have and how they change, we need to sample manure and make sure we use the correct sampling procedure. People have preferences on sampling ahead of pumping versus sampling at pumping. Either is fine, as so long as we use the right procedure. If we are going to core sample ahead of pumping, we want to use a plastic pipe to take a core all the way to the bottom. One thing about this is when you're doing that, make sure your sampler is big enough that you can get an accurate sample, that it doesn't plug with solids as you're going down. And make sure you take enough cores. Core sampling, to do it right, is fairly labor intensive. The other thing that a lot of growers I've seen are switching to sampling at pumping once the pit is fully agitated. An easy way to do this is to take the cleanout cap off the loadout stand if you are using tanks, and they put a reducer on there with a ball valve, and they'll take some samples while they're pumping out a loadout stand while they're loading. Here again, one thing you want to be careful with is make sure you flush that valve out before you take your sample, because what's going to happen is as you're loading, you're going to get a accumulation of solids stuck in that valve that could give you a higher test than what you're actually getting. Another big area that we see is making sure that the manure applicator is putting manure on evenly. All applicators have some sort of a distribution manifold on them, and there's a lot of different designs on the market. What we need to make sure is that we are running the minimum number of gallons that manifold needs to be accurate. On tanks, that generally works out to be 2,500, 3,000 gallons an acre at normal field speeds. If you've got hilly fields, you may need a higher rate than that because you're going to have to slow that tank down. You may not be able to drive fast enough. Also keep in mind that these manifolds can be inaccurate depending upon the design on the steepness of the slope. There's been some data on testing these, and the short answer is tanks that have manifolds that exit out of the top are some of the most accurate. Also, ones that are circular and have outlets all the way around the manifold with some kind of a chopper blade inside of them. Those are another style that are accurate. There's some newer ones coming onto the market that are pretty good too, but we don't necessarily see those a lot. I'll hit on this too at pumping. We really want to treat manure like anhydrous and start applying when it's 50 degrees and falling. I know that's not always practical, but at least keep that in mind if we can. Next slide. We got a lot of calls this fall on stabilizers for two reasons. One is because the manure is valuable, and two, everybody wanted to start applying early. So we thought we'd throw a couple slides in and talk about these briefly. There are really three classifications of these products. The chemical type, and I singled it out here, which is Nitro Pyron. It's marketed as Instinct. It's been around for quite a long time. There's a newer generation of products that are generally kind of grouped in and called polymer-based products. And then there's also some bacterial products that'll claim some nitrogen stabilizing. So we'll dive into these here on the next slide. Okay, so Nitro Pyron. It is the first and oldest of all these products, identified in 1962. It's even older than I realized when I looked this up. And I've got a couple different studies here to show you a couple different things. The one on the left I don't have a chart for is some work out of Iowa State in 2009 and 2010. And 2009 had normal rainfall. 2010 had greater than above average rainfall. 2010, they got a positive yield response and a 50% probability of a profitable return. This is also, so what that study didn't look at is that, higher grain prices, higher fertilizer prices, and increased also add into the increased precipitation of a likely positive ROI when you look through the data. The other thing that a lot of times gets mentioned, and you can find studies that'll prove pretty much anything you want to prove, is that time of application matters with inhibitors. They only have a certain amount of life expectancy. If you look on the right-hand side, there's a little chart here. This was some work done at Iowa State in 16 through 18. The difference being this used late fall manure instead of early fall. And this is actually shows one of the best increases I've seen. There's about a 15 bushel increase between late fall manure and late fall manure with inhibitor, which shows for a nice positive. A lot of studies will try to indicate to use it earlier. The issue is it may not last long enough to get it to where you need it. The other interesting side note is the bar on the right of this chart, and that is spring manure. So late fall manure with inhibitor, which was Nitro Pyron, did better than untreated late fall manure, but spring manure beat all of those. We're seeing people add more spring manure. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's not always as bad as what people think. Next slide. Newer generation polymer inhibitors, they are the first ones I'm aware of came out about 15 years ago. There's not it's very difficult to find data on these inhibitors. Not very little has been tested by the universities in manure. The only studies I've been able to find were benchtop studies, not field studies. One of the early ones, and this is an old study from when the first one came out, which is what it's showing is the change from ammonia to nitrate on a lab setting. And the takeaway from this is the treated is the square, sorry, the untreated is the square, and the treated is the circle. The lines follow themselves nearly identically. There's only one variation on there at week 3. This indicates that it did not work in laboratory testing. These polymer products are kind of easy to identify. When you add them to the pit, they have a pretty strong reaction. They release a lot of CO2. The issue is that reaction is localized where you're adding it, so you're not really going to see any solids removal except maybe in the pump outs where it's being added. It's never going to make it to the center wall of the building, for example. These products also tend to make some claims on increased phosphorus availability. The thing to keep in mind is that the research data that we use in Iowa when we write manure management plans and such from Iowa State would tell us that phosphorus is 80 to 100% available without any kind of treatment. So I'm not sure that it's going to be cost effective to try to increase that number. What I would say about these products, and there's multiple ones on the market. If somebody's trying to sell them to you, ask for independent test data and not just anecdotal side-by-sides or manure samples from their own data. They should be able to provide some university data to back up what they're selling. Next slide. Bacterial treatments. There are a lot of bacterial treatments out there, but they're not all created equal. One thing that I would say, however, is that they have limited effectiveness in preventing nitrogen loss once we get to the field. Some manufacturers make some pretty lofty claims on these. This goes back to what I said on the other products. Ask for some independent test data to back that up because I've not personally seen it. Where the bacterial treatments tend to vary is frequency, form, and placement. So some need to be added monthly or every couple of months. Others, like Manure Magic, only have to be added once a year. Some are liquid, some are dry. The liquid products have a lot more volume that you have to handle. Also, placement of the products and how they get added to the pit. Some are easier or harder than others. These treatments will stabilize the ammonia release from the pit and make them and reduce odor. Manure Magic does a wonderful job of that. What these treatments, what bacterial treatments are, and why we really recommend using Manure Magic, is because we bring the solids up off the pit, we make the manure more homogeneous, and probably the biggest one is less time to agitate. Saves fuel, saves equipment cost, and if you're hiring a commercial pumper, they may not want to wait to agitate before they start pumping. So that's where the real benefit is there. Next slide. So what can we do to keep our nitrogen? There's a few things. So getting back to a point I kind of mentioned earlier, approximately two-thirds of the nitrogen in deep pit swine manure is going to be ammonia, and it'll range a little bit, but two-thirds is an easy number to work with. The one-third that's organic is going to be more stabilized. So we always preach handle it just like we would anhydrous ammonia. Start applying when the temperatures are falling, 50 degree soil temps are 50 degrees and falling. Inject manure as deeply as possible. The issue here, there's a lot of good injectors on the market now. The older style double disc openers where the manure kind of oozes out the top, those are not great for loss. Those will definitely increase your loss relative to newer injectors. If we realize that we're going to have to apply early. I mean, that's just part of being in this business. Start on the heavier, higher organic matter soils. Avoid the river bottom ground, the low organic matter type soils until late fall, until the soils get really cold. Make them the last thing you do, or even delay those until spring. Particularly those lighter soils will dry out in the spring faster, and we can potentially get tanks on them and not cause compaction. Spring manure, I know it's not everybody's favorite, but it's worth trying a little bit here or there and see how it works on your soils in your area. Next slide. We've been big proponents of verifying the nitrogen status of your field. The traditionally spring nitrate test pre-side dress, it was one of the ways we've done it. These work pretty well, but there is some variability, so you have to divide the field up correctly and sample the correct areas to get the correct result. You don't want to mix too many areas that are too different in one sample. But the good news is they're cheap and effective. We see a lot of climate and satellite weather in-loss models coming to the market. The ones that I'm aware of are Granular, Climate Field View Pro, and Adapt In. Adapt In being the Cornell model that has now been commercialized. I've seen a fair amount of data out of Granular and Adapt In. Both seem to have worked pretty well for the customers that use those options. There's optical side dress bar mount sensors. Think Green Seeker, Optrix, those kind of things. They work both on, if you're side dressing, anhydrous 32, even work on over-the-top urea. We don't see a lot of those due to cost. Drone-mounted optical NDVI sensors are another option. I think we're going to see a lot of this in the future. You can fly a field, scan it, and then make a prescription to load into whatever applicator you're doing and verify what's going on. When we do find nitrogen loss, historically, people have used liquid nitrogen, or some people have used anhydrous as well. Both work really well. Anhydrous is going to be your cheapest option if you have flat fields. If you have hills, what I am typically seeing, thanks to the improvement in application equipment, we can now put a spinner box on a high clearance sprayer and put urea over the top. That works incredibly well. It's also fast. You can cover a lot of acres. The only catch there is we really need to do that in a year with normal rainfall, or at least know that we got rain on this calendar, coming up and then in the forecast the next day or two, to avoid the loss of nitrogen there. The other one that can't be understated, and this will vary a little by state, but particularly in Iowa, there are different ways that you can calculate your manure management plan on sites that are regulated. And I mean, there are different legal ways to do it. So work with whoever does your manure management plan or your nutrient management plan to make sure you have the highest maximum rates that you can get. Generally speaking, the manure nitrogen is still going to be cheaper than any of your commercial options. You can go to the next slide, Justin. Oh,
sorry about that.
No problem. One thing too to mention is soil testing. Historically, people have felt that if we're putting manure out there, we are automatically building our soils, and the fertility is a lot less of an issue than if we put on commercial. Getting back to the idea that this manure does not have a lot of excess phosphorus in it like it used to, we really want to make sure that we are soil sampling our manured fields the same way that we would sample our fields that receive commercial fertilizer. And that is some sort of a grid sample. 2.5 acre grids are usually the most cost-effective grids size that we have for the amount of data. When we're grid sampling, we need to make sure we take at least 10 to 15 cores. There's some companies out there that will tell you, oh, we can do 5 or 6 and save you some money. That's not a place that I would save money if we're going to pay for the lab test. Let's do it right. Avoid sampling by zones. I talk about this a lot by soil type zones. The soil type maps are pretty old and pretty inaccurate. And when we lay in productivity zones, usually based on yield, they do not always, and most of the time, do not line up exactly with the soil types. So if we want a zone sample, let's do some kind of a hybrid composite that uses yield as the basis, and then we maybe subdivide those based on soil type, soil test, previous soil testing, things of that nature. But strictly on soil type, I would avoid that. And the real reason that I'm pushing on the soil testing is that we need to know how much P and K we have out there so that we can adjust our strategy of manure and also mixing in commercial fertilizer. Even a field that has roughly optimum soil tests tend to have a lot of low areas and high areas all in the same field. And 2, lime as needed. If you're in an area that tends to have low pH, when pH gets low, we tie up both the macros and the micro elements. Next slide. Okay. We'll talk just briefly about a few strategies that we've seen a lot of people employ this year, or that are probably the most cost effective. Kind of using our deep pit swine barn as an example here. So using a typical manure analysis that we see when we average them together, in a corn soybean rotation, the nitrogen rates for corn are not going to put on enough P and K to build the soils. And we're actually probably, in a lot of cases, going to be deficient on both P and K for the soybean crop. So this is where the soil testing comes in. What we really want to do is put enough nitrogen out there to grow a corn crop, and then take and put our manure application data against our fertilizer recommendations, and basically build a map of where the deficient areas in the field are, and then we can go out and variable rate spread those accordingly. There's also a lot of positive data on using potash ahead of soybeans. Some of this has to do with the lack of potash and potassium in manure. Other is that beans just do well, just have a positive response from it in general. So more and more, especially as yields get higher, we're going to probably have to do more prescription commercial fertilizer in between those rotated years when we're receiving manure. In a corn-on-corn situation, it's a little bit different. Most of the time, if we apply manure every year for 1 year of corn, we can probably meet their phosphorus and potassium needs of that crop. So we may want to back the manure rate down, just apply enough for the phosphorus and or the potassium, and then supplement the nitrogen with some commercial N. Of course, the one thing to keep in mind is I'm talking deep pit manure here. If you're doing lagoon manure, that kind of thing, sometimes these strategies may be reversed, or they'll look quite a bit different. Applying commercial N with manure is kind of a regional thing. As I travel around just the state of Iowa, there are some places that everybody does it. There are some places that almost nobody does it. Hit the next slide. So the most typical strategy is to apply manure in the fall and then apply some liquid nitrogen in the spring. I see people doing it with a planter. Probably most common is with pre-emerge herbicide. Even a few will try some kind of a weed and feed program. 10 to 15 gallons of 32% is pretty common. Roughly, that works out to be 35 to 50 units of nitrogen. And basically, the idea there is that when we fall apply manure, even if we're not losing it, it's going to be working its way down the soil profile. And we want to put some nitrogen in the spring at the top to give that plant something to work with and make it start growing quickly so that it can put down roots to the nitrogen from fall and the manure that has moved down. There's also the organic fraction, particularly if we have manures that maybe have a little higher organic fraction of nitrogen in them. That'll become released over the season, so that extra 32 liquid nitrogen boost will help. One interesting study, this is out of the On-Farm Network's Iowa Soybean Association here in Iowa, and they compared manure to manure plus 50 pounds of N. And if you've seen the marginal nitrogen rate calculator, once you hit a certain point, and 200 pounds in this study, they took different rates of manure nitrogen, and the response was fairly uniform across all of them. In a majority of the studies, they saw a yield jump from adding the 50 pounds of commercial in over half of the trials. So in corn, they added 8.1 bushels, and in corn on corn, they added 11.5 bushels in the trials where they added it. So that kind of backs up one of the ideas that we see people doing all the time. I think oftentimes when I hear people that say their manured acres don't yield as well as their commercial acres, those manured acres are not getting nitrogen. So this is one thing I'd like to see more people try. Next slide.
All right, thanks, Seth, for covering all that. Some really useful information. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about one of those bacterial options that Seth mentioned a little bit earlier. And I don't know if you guys saw the Facebook post or LinkedIn, wherever we posted about, if you leave a foot of manure in a pit at current fertilizer prices, and again, they're likely heading north, somewhere between $8,000 to $11,000 in a 2,400 head barn if you leave 12 inches of manure. So if there's ever been a time to try a pit additive to try to get as much of that stuff out as possible, I think this would be the year. So generally, we're going to make basically the same claims as most of the other bacterial products on the market. I think where we differentiate ourselves is we do have that independent data that Seth was talking about earlier. And then on application, we are quite a bit different. So we do have data from Iowa State showing that we prevent foaming. We don't do a great job of treating foam, but if you don't have foam already, you get your pit treated. We do a really good job of keeping that foam from showing up. And all we're essentially doing is there is a bad bacteria that's causing that foam. You add the bacteria that are present in Manure Magic, and we outcompete the bad bacteria essentially. So eliminates crusting. So obviously that reduces your flies in the barn, reduces the number of flies that you'll have to eat during the summertime. Easier, more consistent pump outs, I think, is huge. And again, help reclaim that pit capacity by breaking down those heavy solids. And obviously the key take home, more manure available out of the pit. And again, the biggest difference with this product compared to some of the others on the market is one application after each pump out rather than the ones that you have to do monthly or even just 2 or 3 times a year. We're just one application. If anybody has pull plug or flush system, probably the biggest benefit there is making those flushes go a whole lot easier, significantly less line jetting. And again, you can't get away with one application per year. You have to do one application between each washout. That is, unless you're in a system where you're using recycled water from the lagoon. That recycled water tends to have enough bacteria in it to keep the system flowing with a once annual application. And that would be the case with the lagoon there. Help manage sludge depth and levels, reclaim lagoon capacity, doesn't impact the nutrient value that you need for your crops. So again, one application, really easy to apply. A study that we did with Purdue University, back to some of that independent data, reduced hydrogen sulfide by 50% and odor by 43%. Is what that study found at Purdue. So I'll just play a quick video with a testimonial. I don't know, some of you guys may know Gary Bolin. He actually doesn't raise pigs anymore, but this is at a time when he did, and he was using Manure Magic.
We had a lot of odor. Every time it was a hot day, a southwest wind, it was in our house. A northwest wind or northeast wind, and the neighbors could smell it quite badly. It's been a problem, and it's made it hard to just live your life. I met the people from Manure Magic. I believed what they said, but I was still very leery because I've tried several products and they just have not performed. We are 8 weeks from when we put it in. I would say our odor's been killed by 90%. By the 4th of July, my daughter had a party here. We had a southwest wind. There were a lot of college kids. I was concerned that it would smell. They didn't even know we had an earthen basin over there or pigs on the farm.
So what is Manure Magic? Just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like. It is a dry product. Application, generally either sprinkle it across the slats and wash it in, or do it before if you're between turns, you can sprinkle it across and run sprinklers and then power wash. We just ask that you stay at least 48 hours away from disinfectant. We are adding a lot of bacteria. Disinfectant is designed to kill bacteria, so we want to make sure those two things don't come in contact. In that picture and in that video, you will see a little bit of clumpiness. As soon as that product hits water, it will dissolve and get down into the sludge layer where we want it to be. So probably the biggest thing, outside of the application process that we talked about that differentiates this product is that we do have a patent on the delivery method of microbes, and that is a combination of an engineered porous media, which is silica, and the targeted microbes. And that silica is food grade, so it's completely safe for the pigs. We don't want them to eat it, but if they do happen to ingest it, absolutely no toxicity issues from that side. So this is actually an electron scanning microscope picture of the silica with the bacteria loaded on it. So it's kind of a lattice network on the inside of that silica, and it helps to protect the bacteria that we're adding. And again, this product is heavier than water, so it sinks through the liquid layer and, like I mentioned, gets down into the sludge where we want it to be. And then the silica continues to help protect it so that it can proliferate and spread throughout the pit. This is a recent data that we've gotten back from a customer. This was actually a trial that they did on their own. Their goal was to try to reduce agitation and in some cases try to not have to agitate in some deep pit barns. Obviously, Seth mentioned how important agitation is, but in this particular case, their goal was to not have to agitate as much. So they found that treating the barns 2.5 to 3 months before they were planning to pump out was when they saw the maximum amount of microbial activity. So there's turnover in that pit, there's bubbling, things are getting mixed together, and that's when they saw the most homogeneous mixture without having to agitate. So as you can see from this, in treated versus untreated barns, they were able to get out basically twice the amount of solids from the treated barn with Manure Magic compared to the untreated barn, and then all the nutrients basically tracked with that. So not necessarily something that we would recommend in every situation, but obviously it just shows the efficacy of the product, that you're able to get out twice as much solids even without agitation. For anybody that does have a lagoon or flush system, this was a trial that we did back in 2018. Their issue was, Letitia, there's somebody waiting in the lobby. If you could let them in. A study done in 2018, their issue was accumulation of solids in those shallow pits that wouldn't flush out. So they were constantly having to call out somebody to jet those lines. So by treating with Manure Magic in those, they treated the pits and they treated the lagoons because, they, again, I mentioned earlier, recycle water. They're using water from the lagoons to help flush those pits. So they treated both the barns and the lagoon. And by the end of the following year, they saw a 68% reduction in total jetting service called compared to the previous year, which was a massive cost savings for their operation. So that's pretty much it. We wanted to keep this brief as we could this morning. So at this time, we'll take any questions either through the chat or if you guys want to speak up and ask any questions. I didn't really do a great job of introducing AgVice at the beginning. Seth, if you want to cover a little bit of what you guys do, and Samantha DeWitt is on as well, co-owner of AgVice.
How do you protect nitrogen?
So we don't make nitrogen protection claims at all. We don't think that we think that there's too much variability. I have had customers tell me that they've seen increased yields from using our product. I think it's anecdotal at best. I think the main thing that we help do from a fertilizer value standpoint and an increase in nitrogen standpoint is to help get those solids out of the pit. So we don't make claims on nitrogen stabilization at all.
Just talking about us a little bit. So my business partner Samantha and I, we started this business a few years ago. We do manure management plans, new livestock confinement permitting and siting in the state of Iowa. We also do a considerable amount of soil sampling and agronomy services that way. And we recently just launched our My Manure app website, which allows growers to track their application history, their soil tests, their manure management plan, and their manure application history, all from one online web portal and web app.
All right. Anybody else have any questions? All right. If there's no other questions, again, I appreciate you guys joining us this morning. Apologies for the shift at the last minute to a Teams meeting, but appreciate you being flexible with us. We will have a recording of this that we can send out to everybody if you want to go back and review any of it. And like Letitia mentioned, we'll send a link to that video that we couldn't get the audio playing on either. And then you can obviously follow us on our Facebook page, drylet.com, and AgVice has a Facebook page as well that I would encourage you to follow. So if anybody wants to reach out to me, my contact information is on our website, or you can give me a call. My cell phone number is 252-230-6045, or you can email me at jwhitley, WHITLEY, at drylet.com. So again, appreciate everybody joining. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.